So chapter 42 is about ecosystems and energy, and this is going to extend on our population ecology, community ecology, and now we're adding in whole ecosystem ecology, basically. So when we look at the difference between a community and an ecosystem is that an ecosystem also includes the abiotic factors. So while a community was talking about the interactions between populations, now we're looking at how temperature, rainfall, soil quality, water, nutrients, energy also plays a role in communities, making it an ecosystem. Okay, so the two new things we're going to talk about are energy flow and chemical cycling. So these are both abiotic factors that influence population dynamics. So when we look at this image, you can see that there are different arrows, and the arrows represent different things. And so with the blue arrows, that's representing the flow of nutrients through a food web or through an ecosystem, while the red arrows are representing the energy that flows. So we're going to talk about both of those today. And so here you have the sun. The sun is the ultimate source of energy on the planet. However, if you look at ecosystems that don't have access to the sun, like the bottom of the ocean, for example, they're going to have a different source of energy that we'll talk about in class. But anyway, so you have energy, but you also have what we call like nutrients or the matter. So you have energy and matter. Matter would include carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, the things that make us who we are. Okay, so here we have carbon dioxide, and we know about photosynthesis. So when this plant takes in the carbon dioxide, that carbon is going to be transformed from an abiotic molecule of carbon dioxide, and that carbon will be used and stored in like a peach, for example. So now it's part of glucose. And when that squirrel eats that peach, so here you have your glucose molecule. You can see how there's carbon in it. The squirrel will maybe use its mitochondria to break down that glucose and use it for energy. Now, in the process of breaking those bonds, some of that energy is given off as heat. And the potential energy is given off as heat. And that is not accessible energy in an ecosystem. It's not free energy. Okay. And so, next we have like a raccoon that may eat that squirrel. Again, some of the energy that's stored in the body of the squirrel as that raccoon processes that food, some of the energy in the bonds will become off as heat. And then as the coyote eats the raccoon, same thing, some of the potential energy in the body of the raccoon will be given off as heat. And so as we go through a food chain or a food web, the amount of energy that you start with in the primary producers, that value, that amount of energy that's available as free energy or usable energy decreases as you go through a food web or food chain. Now, matter, on the other hand, so here's that carbon dioxide that became part of a glucose molecule. So it's carbon as CO2 is now just carbon as part of glucose. Now, that squirrel may break it down with their mitochondria and breathe that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, transforming it again, or it might store it in a molecule of fat, fatty acid. Either way, let's go with like the fat example. So now that carbon is in a chain of fatty acids. So when the raccoon eats the squirrel, the carbon is now in the raccoon. The raccoon may use that fat as a source of energy and then exhale the carbon dioxide, or the carbon in a form of carbon dioxide, or it may poop out that carbon. And if it poops out that carbon, well, maybe a dung beetle will come and eat that carbon. Or maybe it's now used to build amino acid and stored in its muscle tissue. Remember, there's a carbon in our amino acids. And so if that coyote eats that raccoon, maybe it's taking the carbon in the form of fat or in the form of protein. And now that coyote can use that meat as a source of energy, or to build its own body. And so when we look at matter, like in this example, it was carbon, the carbon doesn't get used up. It just gets transformed from abiotic in the air to biotic, which is part of the organisms, and it gets passed along from one location, I guess, to another, from the air to the plant to the squirrel, maybe back to the air or to the raccoon. It doesn't get used up. It doesn't get consumed. It just gets transformed. versus the energy. The energy does get used up. The energy flows through the ecosystem, being used up as or converted to heat into not usable forms as it transfers through the food chain or food web. Okay, so if you want to compare and contrast the flow of energy and the flow of matter in your box 1, that would be fantastic. So now, though, when we look at ecosystems, we're going to talk about that bottom level of the food webs, the primary producers, like the plants. So we have what's called primary production, and that is where plants are going to take sunlight and convert solar energy into chemical energy, which is usable or free energy for ecosystems. So when we look at primary production, it's the amount of light energy converted into chemical energy by autotrophs. So that chemical energy is the energy stored in the bonds of our glucose molecules. Now that might be cellulose, it might be glucose, fatty acids, amino acids, etc. But the idea here is the plants are able to take that solar energy and convert it into usable forms for the rest of the ecosystem. Now when we look at this previous rainforest versus this desert, this baby Joshua tree here, how do we compare these two in terms of primary productivity? Like how much photosynthesis is happening? When we look at it, you can maybe make a guess that this rainforest ecosystem has a lot more primary production compared to this desert. Now, they both have ample amounts of sunlight. So now you have to think about, well, what are the limiting factors? How come this desert isn't full of plants doing photosynthesis if it's full of sunlight? Well, here the limiting factor is water. Plants need water, and they need sunlight, and they need carbon dioxide. And so here in this desert, it has less has less water falling from the sky, and therefore has less primary production occurring. And so primary production, go ahead and summarize that in your box 2. Now here, when we look at our gross primary production versus net primary production, what we see here is the gross is the total. So the total amount of energy from sunlight that's converted into chemical energy. But these flowers here, these plants are going to use some of that energy. They're not just doing it for us. The plants are going to use some of their energy for their own life, for reproduction, for growth, for metabolism. And so plants will use some of the energy that they, some of the food that they create from the sun and carbon dioxide and water. And so with this, whatever is left over after the plant has used some of that energy is called NPP, or net primary production. So if you want to look at a little formula or something, it would be the gross primary productivity, the total amount of solar energy converted into chemical energy and stored in the plant, minus what the plant used for its own, and then what is available for the next trophic level is the net primary productivity. So when we look at like this diagram from the textbook, you can see gross primary productivity is all of the glucose produced during photosynthesis. But the plant's going to use some. They have mitochondria. They do respiration. They will break down some of this glucose. So whatever is left for the next trophic level for those herbivores or omnivores to eat and have energy for their survival, we call that net primary productivity. And so when we look at net primary productivity in different biomes, you can look at terrestrial means land, aquatic means water. You can see how swamps, marshes, tropical rainforests, temperate forests have lots of net primary productivity. They have lots of sunlight, lots of water, therefore they're able to support lots of photosynthesis, versus the desert or extreme desert has very low rainfall. There's not a lot of water to support plant life, and therefore you'd have low net primary productivity. Now, estuaries are kind of where, not really like shorelines, but like kind of like wetlands, or where like fresh water meets ocean water, and it's in shallow waters, and so you have nutrients, you have sunlight, you have dissolved oxygen, and so you're going to have quite a bit of photosynthesis occurring. Whereas if you think about the open ocean, the open ocean may have tons of sunlight and water, but it may be lacking nutrients like nitrogen or phosphorus, therefore making it harder for the plants to, or the phytoplankton to grow in the ocean and do photosynthesis. Okay. And so here, if you want to make a note in your box number 3 about how gross primary productivity and net primary productivity are related, that would be fantastic. All right, and so our next component is energy transfer between trophic levels. And so when we look at how the energy transfers, so the amount of available free energy in an ecosystem and how it moves from one trophic level to the next, it's approximate that only about 10% of the energy is available to the next trophic level to make new biomass. I love this idea right here. So to actually build themselves. And so when we think about, well, where does the rest of that energy go? Like here's a plant doing photosynthesis. You have the GPP, and then the NPP is what's left over and available. So when the rabbit comes and eats the plant, energy passes on, and now the rabbit's going to use some of that energy for growth, for reproduction, for life. And as the rabbit eats that food, a lot of it will be coming off, the energy in the bonds will come off as heat, and that's not free energy. It's not available to be used to support life. And so the amount of chemical energy in that consumer's food that is converted to new biomass during a given period is a secondary production. So if you think about it, of all the food the rabbit eats, how much actually becomes part of new cells of that rabbit, actually becomes part of new biomass? Now that's the amount that's actually available to the next trophic level. So herbivores only consume about 1/6 of the plant material produced globally, but they cannot digest all of it, right? So when we look at cellulose in plant cell walls, that's not digested. That's not free energy for the rabbit. So then that would go to detritivores are organisms that feed on dead and decaying material. They're kind of like decomposers, but not totally. Okay. So you're going to have a lot of the the energy consumed by decomposers. So here, though, when we look at production efficiency, here's a caterpillar. If there's 200 joules of energy in the leaves that this caterpillar is living on, and the caterpillar eats about 200 joules worth of energy, 33 joules or so will become 33 joules of the 200 joules of the potential energy in the leaf was used for growth. So what happened to the rest of that, right? So when we look at this, as the mitochondria in the caterpillar break down the glucose, some of the energy stored in the bonds, as those bond breaks, the energy comes off as heat. And some of the energy, potential energy that was in the leaves of those is now coming out as poop. And so the caterpillar didn't use that energy. And so some of the 200 joules will pass as feces and be released as heat when detritivores break it down. So our energy flows through ecosystems. It does not cycle through. And so you need a constant input of energy with the sun and plants. So only energy stored as biomass, like as part of the cells and part of the macromolecules, the carbs, lipids, or proteins that make up the organism, is available for growth or reproduction for the next trophic level. And so here's just a diagram you can see broken down basically of what I just showed you. Okay, so when we look at this picture here, I think this is where we will start in class. Well, okay, so here if this squirrel and this caterpillar both consume 1,000 joules of energy, the caterpillar is going to use about 180 joules for growth, whereas the squirrel is only about 16 joules is used for growth. So how would you explain the fact that insects and microorganisms have production efficiencies of roughly 40%, while birds and mammals have low production efficiencies in the range of 1 to 3%? Fascinating, right? How come so much energy is not used for biomass in mammals? Where is it going towards? So when we look at the difference between insects and microorganisms versus mammals, and birds, I guess, you have the breakdown of endotherms and ectotherms. So one of the coolest things is that as mammals, we maintain, and birds do as well, maintain constant body temperature. Therefore, we have to eat more food in order to create the heat to keep us at that constant 98.6 degrees. Therefore, we have greater calorie requirements in comparison to a reptile or other cold-blooded organism. An alligator that has the same body mass as I do would require way less resources simply because they don't use it to maintain body temperature. All right.